Good evening. I'm Professor Sarah Churchwell, Director of the Being Human Festival at the University of London School of Advanced Study. And that was briefly Adam Rutherford, who will be rejoining us in a minute. Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for coming. You can stay up or come as you like. Hang out if you wish. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Adam Rutherford and everyone to our Being Human in Conversation event tonight. I do have a few introductory notes before we begin our conversation. First, a little bit of housekeeping. There are captions available if you press the CC button in your toolbar, and you can also hide subtitles via the same button if you prefer. Please note that the chat function is closed for this event, but you will be able to ask questions during our conversation. For this, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. Again, there's an icon in the toolbar. Please also be aware that this event is being recorded and that any question you ask and the answer will form part of the recording that will be made available online. If you prefer to ask your question anonymously, you can just tick the anonymized box before you submit your question. This evening's event is part of the Being Human Festival, which is taking place across the United Kingdom between the 11th and the 20th of November. We are right smack in the middle of it. It is the UK's National Festival of the Humanities, run by the School of Advanced Study here at the University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy, and with generous funding from Research England. Events are taking place both in person and online this year, and you can see the full program on the Being Human website at www.beinghumanfestival.org. The festival can be found on Twitter at Being Human Fest and on Facebook and via Being Human 2021. Oh, sorry, hashtag 2021. So I am delighted to introduce Adam Rutherford, Dr. Adam Rutherford, who is a geneticist, writer, and broadcaster. He writes and presents documentaries for BBC radio and television, such as BBC Inside Science, exploring topics including evolution, genetics, and anatomy. He has written hugely successful books on these subjects, including the Sunday Times bestseller, How to Argue with a Racist. Early next year, Adam has a new book coming out called Control, which explores the dark history and troubling present of eugenics, which we'll be talking about tonight. And I can attest to the fact that his brilliance has not yet attenuated in that book. There's a lot there to discuss, and we're going to get into at least some of it tonight. We're extremely lucky to have him here with us tonight to discuss why these scientific conversations need the humanities generally and history in particular. So, as we said, if you'd like to ask us any questions on these topics, please drop them into the Q&A box as we go. Please don't wait, because we're not planning to do a separate Q&A at the end. And I got a note that maybe I dropped out for a minute there. So just to be clear, this event is being recorded, and that recording will be made available online. So please bear that in mind when you ask any questions. So, we're not envisioning tonight as a Q&A where I'm interviewing Adam, but rather as a more genuine and hopefully organic conversation between Adam's research and mine. For those of you who don't know me, my research focuses on American literary and cultural history in the 1920s and 1930s. Adam you worked on the Human Genome Project, right? Wasn't that part of what you did? Or I got that wrong.
So peripherally, I really worked on the development of the eye at Great Ormond Street.
Okay, there you have it. And he is an expert, as we've said, in genetics. My point in bringing up the specifics there are that people might think that our research literally has no point of intersection. American literature in the 20s and 30s and the work on the eye in Great Ormond Street. And I think that's because we have this kind of, general social assumption that science happens over here and that literature and history happen over here. But in fact, you and I are trying to work on answering some of the exact same questions and looking at the points where they intersect. And we found this out through a series of conversations that we had in real life, where we were sort of off in a corner, talking for hours because there was actually so much about what we were doing that intersected. And we thought it might be nice to pick up some of those points here virtually as well. So enough preamble. I want to begin by getting down to hard science. So we're going to kick things off with a highly scientific, statistically rigorous, stringently tested, not at all anecdotal, online poll. So Amanda, if you could pull up our first poll. This is for the audience. We're going to ask everyone, please, to answer this question. There will be another poll later, so don't use up all of your energy now, but and I'm just going to read out the questions for the recording. The questions are, this is multiple choice, and you can answer all of the answers, tick all of the boxes that apply. So which of these have you used to trace your ancestry? 23andMe, ancestry.com, any other type of DNA kit, or I have not used DNA kits. And as I say, tick all that apply, except all of the above wouldn't make any sense, but anything else, please tick. And we're not allowed to vote, sadly, for us. It's like being disenfranchised, Adam.
Well, you know, I'm all of the above.
How did you manage that?
Highly professional reasons, of course, because as you well know, I'm pretty cynical about the value of those types of tests.
Okay, so we have our results. Okay, most of our respondents, we have 80% have not used DNA kits. 6% have used 23andMe, 20% have used ancestry.com, 6% have used another DNA kit, and then we said 80% have not. Now, this fascinates me. You just said you're cynical about it. As a student of history, I was really psyched when DNA kits came out, and I'm sure I was not alone in this, thinking, great, modern science is going to back up history, and we're going to get these ancient questions about human identity answered. But you've just said you're cynical about them, so the science is the science not going to answer our historical questions?
Depends what your question is, of course, and all, you know, that proper academic answer, a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B. The thing is that I think that there is a fetishization of what DNA is and what it can do. And I think it's really, really sort of ingrained in us. You could almost say it's in our DNA. And if you couple that with the sort of authority that is granted to scientists in society as being arbiters of knowledge, as being keepers of a special type of knowledge, which is held to a very high standard of evidence, then I think that when these types of commercial tests emerged, there was a real sense amongst the public, and more broadly, I'm making some generalizations here, that was like, well, amazing, you know, now there is this extra branch of historical source, which isn't limited to fraying bits of parchment, which can, you know, be digested by worms or lost in time. It's not subject to being buried underground for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's not subject to the whims of people writing the history that is the ones that survive. The fact is that everyone has DNA in every cell in their body, and within those letters of A's and T's and C's and G's, there is a history, not just of us, our families, our ancestors, but in fact, the entire history of our species, and in fact, the entire history of life on Earth. So that's the sort of, you know, that's one polar end of the, my God, this is the new historical source which is going to answer all of our questions. The other end of it is we don't really know how to read a lot of this stuff. It's subject to, it's a lot of conjecture in there. It isn't simply a case that everyone has the DNA of all of their ancestors at all. It isn't simply the case that we carry all of the DNA of our ancestors, and that's only written by, it's written by all of those ancestors rather than just the victors in whatever the conflict that we're describing. So it is just another historical source. It is not more valuable or less valuable. It is not more accurate or less accurate. It is to sit alongside all of the traditional forms of knowing the past in a complementary way. And I think when this sort of began to emerge as a you know, 10 years ago, I suppose, is when it became serious. When it began to emerge as a sort of plausible way of understanding history using DNA, people got very excited and very overexcited. And then geneticists started behaving badly, or some did, in assuming that our evidence is better than yours because it's much more scientific than the stuff you've been studying for the last 10,000 years, should we say 5,000, just to be sort of conservative. And so there was a sort of reckoning period of trying to work out, you know, what can we say using DNA? What can we how useful is this? How does it sit alongside the known narratives, or the narratives that we presume are true outside of the realm of ancient DNA? And that's where the fun stuff is, right? You know, verifying the stories of history using DNA is amazing, but so is you know, undercutting them. So is saying, well, that's just not what we think. That's not what the DNA says. And then we do what academics do, which is we argue.
That's the fun part, as you say,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But so, you know, but part of what you're saying, right, is that it can't be understood without a context, and that context is narrative and it's historical. That information doesn't just exist. It's not just that it can be interpreted in a vacuum, but that it's interpreted through narrative, through history, and then it may or may not, as you say, it may disprove those histories, and the history may disprove it. But we can't keep them separate from each other.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think that there are the two high points for the use of DNA as a historical source are separated by 40,000 years, right? And the first is a very deep history, an evolutionary history question, which was outstanding in 2008 and answered in 2009, right? And that is, what was our relationship to Neanderthals? So Neanderthals were discovered in the 19th century, early 19th century, and from their first classification, it was concluded, because of their morphology, their physical structure, that they were a different species to us. From the 1960s, 1970s onwards, small questions began to emerge, which were, did we interbreed with them? What was our relationship with Neanderthals? And academics argued about that for a long time. And then in 2009, we just got the answer, right? We got the answer because some researchers who basically pioneered this technique, led by a guy called Svante Paabo in Germany, we managed to get DNA out of the bone of a guy who'd been dead for the last 40,000 years, who was a Neanderthal. And there it is. There's a bit of Homo sapiens DNA in us, in them, in that we have Neanderthal DNA, and so on. And so the answer was definitive, right? Neanderthals weren't our evolutionary cousins, they were our ancestors. So that's one. The other, which I know, you know, people are very familiar with, the other high point was in the identification of Richard III. And that's an amazing story to tell, and I won't go into it now because I think it's, you know, many people know it and it's easy to find out the excitement of that story, not least in one of my books. But the point about that is, and the punchline to that whole thing is that, yes, it was DNA and genetic genealogy that definitively answered the question of whether the bones found in that car park in Leicester were the bones of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king. So a historically significant person. And the answer was an unequivocal yes. But how do we find those bones in the first place? Right? Traditional methods combined with new physical methods like you know, subsonic scanning and the paper trail, and just the fact that Greyfriars was a monastery that still exists as, well, it doesn't exist as a monastery now because it was destroyed in the Reformation, but still exists as an area, and the wall of the social services car park was in line with blah, blah, blah. And then when they dug and got the bones themselves out, the first thing was forensic anthropology, and that, of course, is an older, and blah, blah, blah. And all of the point, you know, the DNA was the last step in that chain and did seal the deal, but none of that existed without all of the old school stuff. And so I think those two examples are the perfect fusion of a new kid on the block that is powerful if done right, but only if done in concert with the traditional ways of knowing the past.
Yeah. Well, as you say, right, I mean, even to start with the first principle of him being, of Richard III being a person of historical significance, that means nothing without a concept of history. And as you say, without the paper trail that establishes that he was a person of historical significance that we might want to look for in the first place. So we have to have all of those stories to actually make people dig into a car park. You know, and that's thanks to Shakespeare, and that's thanks to, you know, and all, you know, as you say. So, so again, we've kind of developed these very artificial divides, these schisms between these ways of thinking, but we're all just trying to understand kind of, you know, human existence, and bringing all, as you say, all of these different tools, and they're just effectively different tools and paradigms for thinking it through. I was glad that you brought up the example of the Neanderthal from 2008, 2009, because it reminds me of one of my favorite examples from a similar moment. I'm sure you'll remember this great scientific breakthrough that happened in 2007 when Wired magazine ran one of my all-time favorite headlines that said, "Science confirms girls like pink, boys like blue." According to researchers at a university in England, which I will not name and shame, girls really do prefer pink gadgets. And they ran a 2007 pink iPod next to it to prove that we're hardwired, we're biologically programmed to buy pink iPods. Old, I assume the 2007 version. And I don't know if our evolution has caught up to the new ones yet.
Yeah. And yet it would take the simplest of historical research to find out that in the 19th century, pink was associated with boys, to do with blooding and hunting and stuff like that. It took me about, 14 seconds of Googling to answer that question. But no, scientists have proved it.
Exactly.
Scientists have proved it. Powerful.
And then they had a scientist saying that it was evolutionarily driven because females prefer reddish colors, reddish fruits, healthy reddish faces, and that culture has compounded this natural female preference for red faces.
Yeah, I don't know what the swearing rules are on Being Human events, but that's what I would categorize as utter bollocks. It taps into a branch of science which I'm very hostile to. Well, I'm sort of very hostile to, which is evolutionary psychology, where evolutionary principles are abused almost exclusively. There are some good evolutionary psychologists out there, but the ones that make the press, like the ones you've just described, are neither historically accurate nor evidence-based nor have any understanding of either psychology or evolution. And so, but they're the ones that make the headlines because they affirm our biases, and they take contexts which are normally politically ideologically based today and attribute some sort of fantasized historical version to explain our current behavior. And it just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up from the evidence. It doesn't add up from the theory. And yeah, well, it's made a good career for people like Jordan Peterson, but for real scientists, it's problematic.
Yeah, well, right. And you say, so it's not just using the history problematically, but also the science problematically, both of which are being used there to try to, as you say, to reinforce our current political structures and to say that they're ineluctable and that they're biologically determined. And that, you say the Jordan Peterson thing, that's something to do with lobsters and that therefore we are all the way that we are. And one of the things, of course, that does is not only does it naturalize current power structures and biases and say that, it was ever thus. And as you say, history can be used to just prove that really easily when we show that it wasn't ever thus. But it does then tend to not only naturalize existing power structures, but to discourage people from trying to change them. Because if you believe that it's biologically determined, then you will believe that nothing that humans do can alter that. Whereas if you see that all of this is a gender construct to sell pink gadgets to girls, then you can recognize that actually we can make other choices, and it restores human agency in, I think, very straightforward ways sometimes if people are persuaded by these stories. And sometimes, I deliberately chose a funny one, but obviously there are more persuasive versions of that than others. And Jordan Peterson is a good example. Obviously, a lot of people, are really listening to what he has to say.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. And I think that there is a sense, which I think is misplaced in society more broadly, but also within a view held by a lot of scientists, which is that what we do is above the grubby level of human interaction. Our job as science, in principle, is to extract human experience from our understanding of an objective reality. We are flawed beings, our senses are limited, our psychology comes with enormous amounts of baggage and prejudice and so on. And the point of science is to extract all of those subjective views from describing how the universe really is, rather than how we perceive it to be. Now, that's all very well as an objective, but the truth of the matter is all science is done by humans. And so that if we would like to be above the grubby politics of real life, or if we would like to be in an endeavor which is amoral, then that is an objective, that is a target for science, but it's one that's never ever been even vaguely achieved. So the reality of doing science is that what I do, particularly in the human sciences and in genetics, is to try and understand the historical context and the political motivations that have led us to the science that we currently do today. And what I think is that a lot of, admittedly, it is slightly different if you are a quantum physicist or if you are a planetary geologist or chemist. But in the human sciences, the truth of the matter is, and I think historians find this very, very believable, but I think a lot of biologists balk at what I'm about to say, which is that the origins of biology are they don't occur in parallel to the historical event or the historical sort of movements of European expansionism, of colonialism, of the Enlightenment, of the scientific revolution, all of those things that are happening in the 17th to 19th centuries that are fundamentally changing the way that we think about thought and how we construct knowledge. Biology develops not in parallel to those sort of political movements and those political changes, but in service of them. Right, specifically designed to, for example, taxonomize humans such that we can create racial hierarchies, such that subjugating people becomes scientifically justified because this group of people is better than this group of people, or this group of people is more intelligent innately, has an essentialist quality, which is fundamentally different and more valuable than this group of people. And when I say this group of people and this group of people, what I'm talking about is white Europeans and everyone else on Earth. Now, it is undeniable, though many scientists that I talk to deny it, that biology is developed in service of those ideologies. White supremacy in the sense that it was sort of designed in the 17th and 18th century, which is that literally that white people are better than other people, is fundamental to the invention of classification, the invention of taxonomy. It starts with Linnaeus, who classifies humans in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758. And he describes 4 types of humans: Homo sapiens, Affa or Africanus, Asiaticus, Americanus, and Europeanus. And the first 3 are described by skin color, followed by hair texture and color, followed by some value judgments about their character, which include being haughty, lazy, unintelligent, sexually capricious, all negative traits. And Europeanus are described as being white, blonde, beautiful, governed by laws, and elegant and inventive, right? And that's where we start with this. Hundreds of scientists after that try to redefine or re-taxonomize us, but in every single case, without exception, it's hierarchical classification and see if you can guess who comes top. So, Linnaeus, we use Linnaeus's system today. Linnaeus is the father of biology. His taxonomic system is what all scientists, all biologists use to classify all organisms. And the roots of that and the legacy of that is definitely present today, but the roots of what we do in science, in biology today, are fundamentally in service of white supremacy. So just knowing that means that we're not above the grubby politics of the real world. We don't operate in an objective reality. We operate with 500 years of white supremacy directly behind us in what it is that we do. And I just think that's worth knowing.
Absolutely. I think there's so much there for us to pick up on. No, it was great. It's exactly what we want to talk about. And I want to take us to eugenics quite quickly, because that's, you mentioned that, and obviously that's a really important part of what we're both working on, what we want to talk about. But you did remind me just one quick one, which is another example of the same issue. And you mentioned quantum mechanics a minute ago as maybe something that could get to something pure. But actually, one of the first places where I encountered this was with a historian of science in the 1970s who was writing, and he has what I found a really, really compelling argument that quantum mechanics, as we know it, could not have developed without the specific historical, political, and economic conditions of the Weimar Republic in 1918. And what I love about this essay is that he was very reluctantly drawn to admit this because he wanted quantum mechanics to happen ahistorically, because it was pure science. and he's really peevish when he admits that. He's like, it's really annoying because you have to take non-scientist views into account.
So awful for you.
Right, exactly. So speaking of human classifications and superior people and inferior people, I had to listen to non-scientists.
Yeah.
So
Sometimes
anyway,
we have to stoop to conquer.
Exactly. So it's a humorous example, but it's also a serious one, right? It's to the point there that again, science is not produced in a vacuum. That very specific political and historical conditions give rise to science that we view as a discovery, but sometimes as a creation, as in the example of classification. And that classification may be built onto discoveries, but it may also be built onto pseudo discoveries or even fraudulent science. So let's come to that. But first, because we're talking about superior people, let's do one more poll so that everybody has a chance to play along at home. I'm going to ask Adam to read this one out because I think it's better with a British accent. And so, Amanda, if you can bring up our second poll on royal ancestry.
Yeah, you want me to read all of them, or we'll take it in turns?
Yeah, let's go ahead and read them all.
Okay, so the question is, what do you think is the probability that you have royal ancestry? So option 1 is 0%. I'm a peasant all the way down to my scuffed boots. You're lucky you had boots. Is it 30%? My ancestors signed Magna Carta. 60%. My great-great-great-grandmother had a scandalous affair with a duke. 80%. I actually own large parts of Somerset. Or is it 100%? You will address me as ma'am.
You can see we had some fun with this poll.
It's going to be interesting. If anyone ticks option 5, that's going to be interesting.
Right. Exactly. Nobody else may be laughing, but you and I are amusing the hell out of each other.
Okay, vote.
Okay. Again, we can't vote.
No. Well, I think we know where this is going.
I hope we have a lot of peasantry, sturdy peasant stock.
Yeah.
I take your point about the scuffed boots. Yeah, down to my dirty toes.
Don't know you're born.
Okay.
We have our results. Oh no, 49 people are the queen.
Okay, do you want to read out the results, Adam, for our recording?
So 39% of people said 0%, I'm peasant all the way down. 19% said my ancestors signed Magna Carta. 8% said my great-great-great-grandmother had a scandalous affair with a duke. Only 4% only 7 of you own large parts of Somerset. but slightly troublingly, and making me question the veracity of your replies, dear watchers, dear viewers, 49, that is 30%, have said that we should address them as ma'am.
But of course, it's the probability that we ask people to address, right? Is do they think they have 0% chance that they have royal ancestry, 30% chance, 60% chance, 80% chance, or 100% chance? Yeah. So, Adam, there is in fact a correct answer to this question, which we can say without knowing everybody on our audience. We can definitively answer this question, can we not?
We can. The answer is 100% for all of them. And this is why, I mean, I just love this whole area so much, because this says something important about both history and science, which is that the stories we tell ourselves and the narratives that we attach our own personal experience into our understanding of the past are wrong historically, and they're wrong scientifically. And our quest, our love of finding both significance in our ancestry, and maybe therefore significance for ourselves in the messiness of history, but also a sense of identity from who our ancestors is paramount. But they're just neither historically nor scientifically correct. What happens in family trees is actually we have 2 parents and 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents and so on, all the way back through history. But if you just follow the logic of that, it means that after say, I don't know, 7 generations, you've got 2 to the power of 7 ancestors, which off the top of my head, I think is 256. If you keep going back, say 40 generations, which takes us back about 1,000 years to, time of Magna Carta, then the number of ancestors that one person, you, Sarah Churchwell, have on your family tree will be over 1 trillion, right? Because each time you go back 3 generations, you double the number of ancestors. Now, there haven't been 1 trillion people. Our best estimates are that there would have been around about 107 billion people who have ever existed. So we're, 10 times more. You have 10 times more ancestors than the number of people who've ever existed. Obviously, that cannot be true. So what actually happens is that we see family trees that emerge from you, and they branch outwards and upwards, and then they begin to stabilize, and then they begin to collapse in on themselves. And in biology, we call this coalescence. What that means is that you've got 1 trillion ancestral positions on your family tree, but they're occupied by the same people many times over. And that pedigree collapse happens over, well, you want it to happen over as long a period as possible. If you take the Habsburgs of Spain in the 17th and 18th century, pedigree collapse happens over about 6 generations because they all interbreed with each other in a way which is just shocking. I mean, just terrifying.
It didn't work out well either.
No, it didn't. It worked out exactly the opposite of what they were intending, which was that I snuck a sneaky Star Wars quote in one book when I was writing about this, because they were trying to, grasp their divinity, their royal power, by keeping it in the family. But the tighter they grasped, the more it fell through their fingers. And eventually, Charles II, Carlos el Regizado, who should have had 256 ancestors 7 generations back from him, had 29. And that's not enough. That's not enough at all. So his great grandmother, Joana la Loca, well, yes, I sort of gave away the punchline there, who was married to Philip I, Philip the Handsome. She occupies 9 different positions on this family tree across 3 different generations. Again, that is suboptimal. So you don't want that. That happens in a few generations, but all pedigrees do that over enough generations, and you have multiple branches of your family tree that cross through the same individual, a few generations back. By the time you get about 600 years back, we have at least one branch of everyone's family trees that flows through one individual. I'm talking about Europe specifically. And by the time you get 1,000 years back, you get to what's known as the genetic isopoint. And the genetic isopoint is when all branches of all family trees pass through all individuals. And it's a mathematical and genetic fact, a thing that is not conceptual. It actually exists, and it means that 1,000 years ago, the population of Europe alive to the population of Europe who were alive then, who have living descendants today, are the ancestors of everyone living today, which means that if we can demonstrate that anyone in history has living descendants today, then they become the ancestors of everyone today. So then we do take a king from history or a queen. I do Edward III because he pops up on Who Do You Think You Are quite a lot, or Charlemagne because he's the oldest guy that we have decent royal records for. They both have living descendants today because we can prove that genealogically, which means that they're the ancestors of all of us. So, shared ancestry is universal after only sort of 30 or 40 generations. And what that means is that, according to that poll, all 5 categories are correct. We are 100% descended from both royalty and bootless peasants. And that's where history and genetics perfectly align.
But also it shows that then what's unique for some people, if they can trace their ancestry back to Charlemagne, what's unique is not that they're related to Charlemagne, but that they can trace it. So what's unique is the documentation, which is the history, not the science. So it's unique if you've got the papers that prove it. And maybe we can say that still is remarkable, right? In the conflagration of human history, if you've got documentation that you go back to Charlemagne, that's actually kind of cool. But what's cool about it is the paperwork, not your biological, superiority.
Absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely correct. And indeed, there's another layer on top of that, which is that genetic genealogy and genealogy are very closely related, but they're divergent through time, right? So anyone shares 50% of their DNA with their brother or sister and 50% of DNA with either of their parents. And then it's 25% with an uncle, and an eighth with a first cousin, and it works according to, you know, just the maths of dividing by 2. But after about 2 or 3 generations, it just drops off a cliff. So relatedness for third cousins and beyond is minuscule. And if for the proportion of people who said yes to the 23andMe poll question at the beginning, you will know this, because almost all of the matches that come up if you tick the box saying show me my DNA matches, people I might be related to, almost all of them are fourth cousin and above, and the amount of DNA you share with these people is less than 1%. So you may as well not be related to them at all, because everyone on Earth is like a, you know, 12th cousin. Your fourth cousin is almost, you know, unrelated to you. Is not really even in your family at all. So you may be directly descended from Charlemagne, which says nothing about whether you carry any of their DNA or Charlemagne's DNA. In fact, we lose DNA from our blood ancestors the further that you go back through time. The estimates are, the calculations are, that after about 11 generations back into the past, you only carry DNA from half of your ancestors, who you were actually definitely descended from. So the relationship between genetics and genealogy is complex, right? It's not linear. And then where we sort of started this conversation was that on top of that, the interpretation of those sorts of tests, people want to find their identity, people want to find their place in this big old mess. And they say, oh, well, it turns out, you know, I had ancestors in Germany in the 18th century, which explains why I'm methodical, and, you know, fill in your national stereotype here. Or I've got Spanish ancestors, which explains why I'm fiery, temperamented, and insert your national stereotype here. You never get people saying, oh, I'm 4% this, which explains why I'm lazy, or like, I really don't like getting out of bed in the morning. And they're meaningless, right? They're mostly meaningless national stereotypes, but they're certainly not encoded in DNA. And so that's where, again, it is the sort of cultural like normalization of turning to scientists and saying, oh, well, you know, the guy in white coats, they say they've done my DNA because I spat in a tube and it said this proportion of this is this. And that's why I've always felt like taking over Iceland.
Exactly right. So as you say, it's always used to justify, as we said, it's used to justify power. It's used to justify narcissism, collective narcissism, and individual narcissism in order to, you know, aggrandize ourselves. And that does bring us to eugenics, which we need to get to. I'm assuming that most of our audience have at least a passing understanding of eugenics, but just so that we're on the same page, and it is a really complicated subject, but can you just give us just enough of a taster about Darwin and where eugenics comes out of theories of evolution to make sure that everybody in our audience is basically in the same place about eugenics. And then I want to talk about how a certain novel explains everything we need to know about eugenics.
Which is I mean, we should point out that, I mean, this is our real shared passion. This is why we have these conversations. And we'll get to that in just a second. Yeah, so, you know, the idea of population control is universal and has been around for as long as there have been populations. The idea that we can rule unruly biology by selective breeding or by infanticide pretty much exists in every culture that we've known about since records began. By the 17th, 18th century, this is becoming more and more problematic in the West. I'm talking about Western Europe primarily here. As industrialization begins, urbanization occurs, and which means a more visible poor. Right, a more visible poor and with poverty comes health problems, mental health problems, and further demands on resources. Then Malthus comes along and he says, well, we've got this inherent problem, which is that populations that are happy grow exponentially, but resources only ever grow linearly. So we're always doomed to be in a cycle where we're at some points we're out of sync with resources. There are too many people, or there's not enough resources, right? That takes us to the beginning of the 19th century. Yeah, beginning of the 19th century. And then, one of the key events in the history of science, mid-19th century, evolution is already in the air as a concept, but Darwin works out in The Origin of Species that the mechanism by which evolutionary change over time happens, which is via natural selection. And that's all good, and all biology was finished from that point on. That was a joke. Now, briefly and quickly, this is another, what follows is another example of turn to science when you want a political answer. And it all stems from one guy who was Darwin's half-cousin called Francis Galton, who, taking the same view, effectively the same views as Malthus, but also that populations needed to be controlled, applied or believed that you could apply evolutionary theory to human populations and therefore mold a human population to be better, whatever your criteria are, to be better, to either purge the weak, the diseased, or the undesirables. I'm going to use a lot of the language which is contemporary for that time, not much of which is not particularly pleasant to our contemporary ears. So you could purge the weak, and you could enhance the positive characteristics, or the ones deemed positive. And thus, and he coins the term eugenics, well-born, which is what it sort of literally translates to, and begins a movement. And it's quite an esoteric scientific idea in 1869, when it first gets posited, and taps into a political climate in the UK, in Germany, in America, and in other countries around the world, where it is exactly that thing I just said, which is, here's a bit of science which we can use to reinforce our political aspirations or our political ideologies. And it's so universally supported, not universally is too strong, it's so broadly supported that it becomes integrated into political, the political will of powerful nations. Ironically, the UK never had eugenics policies. It was, we came this close with the 1912-1913 Mental Health Acts that were largely written by Churchwell, but the enforced sterilization bit of that was vetoed by Josiah Wedgwood. But in Germany, that didn't happen, of course. And in the 1890s, where the eugenics movement developed over the next 40 years into what would eventually become the deranged policies of the Nazis and the Holocaust. But interestingly, where it took hold most robustly and earliest was in America. A different political context, and this is where we meet, right? Different political context from the UK and Germany, but similar but different, with immigration and nationhood being important issues, various cycles of boom and bust, and so on. And that takes us into the late 1920s, and what happens in the 1920s, Professor Churchwell?
Well, right. So, I mean, you mentioned sterilization, and it's worth just saying as a framework for people that the United States, different, of course, with America, things are localized state by state. There were states in the Deep South that were forcibly sterilizing African Americans through the 1970s. Okay, so just so that we understand the kind of historical context that we're talking about, African Americans were overwhelmingly the groups that were sterilized forcibly. There were also other undesirable population, as you said. They would also forcibly sterilize people who were mentally ill, or people who were learning disabled or neurodiverse. And of course, they would sterilize women who did not obey sexual rules, variously construed. So there were certainly other groups that were subjected to this, but overwhelmingly, it should not surprise any student of American history to know that it was African Americans who were overwhelmingly targeted by these so-called theories. You said earlier, Adam, that you didn't, I think you said this when we were chatting actually before, but that you started out as a science and you kind of had to default into history because the intellectual questions forced you into asking historical questions. And I was the reverse. I started out working on the Great Gatsby, and I didn't think I was working on eugenics and working on the 1920s and 1930s. You actually can't understand what Scott Fitzgerald is doing in the Great Gatsby, the great novel of the American 1920s. I would argue, if you don't understand eugenics, eugenics. And more broadly, if you don't understand these conversations around biological determinism at the time, that come broadly out of eugenics, but are not limited to eugenics per se, or eugenicist. And in their permutations. So ideas like race suicide, and race suicide was popularized in the early decades of the 20th century in America. It was actually a lecturer who came to Princeton where Fitzgerald was studying. He heard these lectures, and race suicide was connected to women's rights, because the idea was that and it was connected to women's suffrage. Remember, women get the vote in 1920 in America, and none of this none of these things are distinct from each other. So as women start to exercise financial and sexual autonomy, and they start to demand reproductive rights, you have a concomitant pushback, a blowback, to try to put them back in their places. And that is and as women get professionalized and they start to exert certain kinds of reproductive rights, they start to have smaller families. So what happens? The best women, the white middle class educated women, are not having enough babies. And you have this theory of race suicide, that what will happen is the white race will die out and all of the wrong people are having too many babies, and we have to do something about this. And this is why you see at the same time that this was happening, and that's again not a coincidence, the Ku Klux Klan was rising in the United States at this point in time for a very specific reason, because they were there to violently enforce all of these ideas about nativism and white supremacism, and that it always included controlling women as well as the undesirable races, Black people and Jewish people in particular, but also Catholics. They were deeply suspicious of Catholics, and of course Catholics are propagating. It was all very, very problematic. So there's an example I often use, which came from the same year that The Great Gatsby is set, and then we'll get into Gatsby, but I think it just kind of epitomizes what we're talking about, which is from 1922, which is when the novel takes place. And it was a Klan parade. So Klansmen were marching in Louisiana in the Deep South, and newspapers at the time reported the banners that they were carrying. And here's what the banners read. They said, "America first, 100% American, white supremacy, race purity, and abortionists beware."
Sorry, when was this?
1922, the year of Gatsby.
Yeah.
So when I show this slide in lectures and when I'm teaching it, people are often caught off guard by that abortionist beware at the end, because it feels like, one of these things is not like the other. Like you're following white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy. And then you suddenly get to abortionists and you're like, why? And of course, it's that 100% American race purity. You can't, because miscegenation, you can't have mixed race breeding, for want of a less eugenicist word, if you want to control white supremacy. So the two are, you have to control women's sexual rights if you want to control, if you want to try to control whiteness, basically.
Yeah. It's such a, I know it's like a cliche to say it, but this is why I think that scientists need to know their history, because everything you just said, Ben, applies in some context to anything you could say about the relationship between genetic genealogy and those types of tests that we sort of were joking about, the 23andMe type tests, which have totally become dominated in certain quarters by the ideas of what you just said, like not just white purity, racial purity, and they run counter to our understanding of how genealogy actually works, that whole thing we were talking about how we should have shared ancestry with everyone. And they run counter to the whole concept of racial purity, which is just not a thing, because race isn't a biologically meaningful thing. None of that shit matters if your ideology comes first. So it doesn't matter whether it's in 1922, when they're doing that with new understandings of human evolution that have been derived from Darwin and then enhanced by people like Galton and a lot of scientists for whom the general tenor of existence was white supremacy, but not who weren't necessarily sort of overt KKK badge wearing racists. But I spent a lot of time hanging around racist forums online, and white supremacist neo-Nazi forums online, and they're obsessed with DNA tests. They're obsessed with racial purity and race mixing, miscegenation, and those types of ideas, because the whole ideology falls apart if they're not this version of white purity, which they're wedded to, which is a fiction.
Yeah. There's so much to pick up on there. Now, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that we want to pick up on, because I think we were probably going too quickly through some of this, and because it seems to have sounded as if we were saying that everybody has a European ancestry to a few people. Now, obviously, we were not saying that, but I want to make sure that, so the question is about those, obviously with racial backgrounds from Asia, from Africa, and we weren't saying that everybody in the world is European. So do you want to just clarify that point? And also, there's a really interesting iteration of that question, which is about how that applies to Indigenous people in Australia or the Americas. So can we just clarify both of those?
Absolutely. No, it's a good point. So the study that I was talking about, the calculations I was talking about, are specifically for Europe, and that is because we know we have the most detailed history of Europe, and we know the most about the genetics of European for structurally racist reasons. So the 1,000-year ISA point, so everyone has shared ancestry 1,000 years ago, applies specifically to Europe. However, the global ISA point is about 4,000 years ago, right? So it isn't that different. And so it would be much, much older, for example, for Indigenous people of the Americas, if it hadn't been for 1492 and the invasion by Columbus. Because the first thing that Columbus's men do when they get off the boat in somewhere in the Central Caribbean is that they rape the Taino women, right? So you have gene flow events, which is how we talk about sex.
Are you talking about rape? The gene flow event? You gotta remember that.
I'm very sorry to say, yeah. But we have gene flow events from European DNA entering populations from day one in 1492, which means that every sexual relationship further on, every reproductive sexual relationship from that point onwards, also potentially passes on non-Indigenous American genetics. And to the extent that there aren't any Indigenous people in the Americas that don't have European ancestry in the same way that I described with the whole Charlemagne thing. And basically the same can be applied across the world. So the global ISA point is something like 4,500 years ago.
Right, thanks. Now I'm going to come back to the Gatsby at the very end. We're probably just going to have a second session, Adam. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to rope you back because there's just so much to talk about, basically like all of human history here. But there are also a handful of questions, and it is the important point, and I want to make sure that we get to it, which is, so here we are saying that there are all of these really, really troubling political uses that bad science and bad history are being put to. So what can we do? How can we begin to get people to think about science as something that is making political choices? How can we begin to reframe the narrative to shift the story? And I'm conflating a bunch of questions there, but a lot of people are asking that urgent question: is what then must we do?
Well, we cross-pollinate. We do what we're doing right now, right? Which is that scientists have to be better at history, and historians have to be better at science. I think that the onus should be on scientists more than it should be on historians. And the reason for that is because I think that there is a tendency amongst my brethren to regard, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, to regard our evidence base and our academic standards for the pursuit of truth to be somehow higher, right? Basically, I think a lot of scientists think that history is easy, and it's not. And I think that, and this is something that I've learned by spending more time with historians than I do with scientists. But like our mutual friend Peter Frankopan is very strict on this, and he always goads me on this, that I and scientists should regard historical evidence with the same scrutiny that we do our biological evidence or our scientific evidence. And I see it over and over again. People in science who are really, really good at scrutinizing evidence that they have produced in the lab, and are really, really casual about, reading Wikipedia or reading one book, or thinking that they understand the cultural ideology or context of an idea that is related to their field. and we just got to be better at it. I'm sorry for that, because I think that a lot of scientists don't get into science in order to spend their time learning the histories of their field. I think maybe that's not a choice. Because otherwise we just do the same shit over and over again. And we're doing it now with taxonomy and essentialism, with DNA, that we did 400 years ago with just morphology as we were exploring Africa, as Europeans are exploring Africa. We're doing it again with conversations about eugenics, that people like Dominic Cummings, or loads of people sort of flirt as tourists in a scientifically semi-literate way with concepts which are hard, really, really hard. And I think repeatedly what we see is, well, now we know loads about DNA, we know loads about the Human Genome Project, and there is this fantasy that's this time round, we won't do the same things that we did 100 years ago. And I think as soon as you start reading what they did 100 years ago in any sort of academic depth, you just go, okay, so that's what we're doing right now, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. We're doing it. We're even using the same phrases.
Some
of them have been discredited, some of them have not, and some of them are being recuperated. That's why I mentioned America first. There are others.
What is taught? So that, I mean, it's such a crucial line in when. Yeah. I adore the Great Gatsby, and I think this is why we're friends. Not just, but
I was saying, is that the only reason, Adam?
It's enough, to be honest.
Fair. I accept that.
But I've adored that book since I was young, and I've read it multiple times. And it was only about 2 or 3 years ago that I read it and thought, holy crap, this is a book about eugenics.
There is.
And I turned to you and went, this is a book about eugenics. And you went, duh.
I was not that rude.
but Tom, it's there. It's on page 2, right? Yeah. Tom Buchanan says, it's science. It's been proved. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah. So maybe that might give us a good place to end, because unfortunately we are out of time. I'm not joking when I say
we haven't even started.
I know. I'm not joking when I say we're going to rope you in. We're just going to have to make this part 1, because we are doing like the history of everything. So we're just going to have to keep doing it. And maybe we'll rope in some more of our friends, and we'll get Frank Opinion to tell us why we're all doing it wrong, because we don't speak 82 languages. Sorry, he's probably watching like this, guys. But
we're very grateful, Pete.
Well, too, it's we only say this because we're big fans and jealous. But I will bring in this famous quotation from The Great Gatsby, maybe to round us off, in part because people often cut it off before the line that to me explains it and that makes clear what Fitzgerald is doing with it. So Tom Buchanan, who's the bad guy, he's the rich plutocrat. Sorry, plot spoiler for anybody who doesn't know the novel. He's also a white supremacist, and this is not incidental to his character. His white supremacism comes up more than once, but so does his pseudoscience. Actually, Fitzgerald brings up Buchanan's pseudoscience 3 times, quite specifically, and the 3rd time, Nick, our narrator, calls it impassioned gibberish. So the novel is not ambiguous about the fact that Fitzgerald views this as garbage. And Nick certainly calls it gibberish. But the first time, as you say, it happens very early in the novel, Buchanan goes on this rant. It's a racist tirade. And he says, civilization is going to pieces. And he's read a book that taught him that one book, like you were saying, it is, I'm sorry to say this if anybody is a fan of Jordan Peterson, but it's very Jordan Peterson. He's like, he's read a book and now he understands the world. And he says, it's scientific stuff. It's been proved. These books are all scientific. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us who are the dominant race to watch out, or the other races will have control of things. We've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? So his whole sentence like implodes, right? Because he doesn't have anything to fall back on. And then Nick says, there was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. So Buchanan is stupid and he's badly educated, and Nick makes that clear, and he's a rich aristocrat. He's got all this money, he's got all this power. What does he need? He needs pseudoscience to bolster it, because his complacency, his arrogance about his own aristocratic entitlements is not enough to him anymore, because democracy is coming for him. And so what he has to do is to try to shore it up with this fake science. and people always cut that sentence, but that's his motivation. And that's where Fitzgerald makes clear that he knows we've been swearing liberally, apologies to the audience, but it's important to tell the truth, that he knows that it's bullshit. And Fitzgerald wants us to know that it's bullshit there. And that's why he calls it impassioned gibberish later on.
It's a crutch. It's a crutch, right? I mean, and people turn to science for validation of their ideologies all the time. Buchanan does it there. Galton was doing it. Churchill was doing it when he was trying to get eugenics policies through Parliament in 1912 and 1913. And now we're doing it again. We're doing it again. It's just a new technology, but the ideology hasn't changed. When you did our intros at the beginning, I want you to play connections with me, because we know each other through sort of literary festivals and our shared interest in Gatsby. But it's when you said, what was your PhD in? And I said it was about the eye. Yeah. Now that there are 3 photoreceptors which are called cones, and they detect color, which is red, blue, and green.
Yes,
yeah?
I knew that.
Now,
That's about all I know.
Okay, but you know more than that. You just don't realize it yet. That was what I worked on, how those cells develop in the back of the eye. So you'd think that your study of early 20th century American history and my study of the development of cone photoreceptors in the eyes are unrelated. Who first described that system? A man called Charles Davenport.
No.
Now, why don't you tell the viewers who Charles Davenport was in relation to Scott Fitzgerald and Gatsby?
Okay, I will, and then that we are over time. I'm sure some people are already leaving, so apologies, but I did not know that. That's incredible. See, we are gonna bring a history of everything here. I would briefly say, so Charles Davenport was he was a very wealthy eugenicist. He funded eugenicism, but he also fought for immigration restriction. So he was one of the leading policy drivers behind the massively restrictionist immigration policies of the 1920s. And he was funded in particular by a wealthy woman on Long Island called Mary Harriman and her daughter Mary Harriman Rumsey, who fell under the sway of eugenics. There had actually been an earlier question about Franz Boas, and that was where she encountered it. We don't have time to get into that, when she was at Barnard. And she persuaded her mother to fund Charles Davenport in his studies into eugenics. And Fitzgerald later said they were wildly wealthy, and that's your point about they were using science to justify their wealth and their privilege. And Fitzgerald later said that the Buchanans were based on the Harrimans and the Rumseys. So, because he encountered them on Long Island, and that's where he sets the Great Gatsby. So he's very, very in a very detailed, specific way, he is bringing the world of 1920s American white power to life. And that's how it spoke. That's how they talked. That's what they thought. And that's what he's capturing there. We have gone over time. Adam, it has been...
You've barely scratched the surface.
I'm serious. This is going to be... I'm going to make you do it again. This is going to be part 1 of however many we have to until we've solved all of the world's problems. Through the Great Gatsby, we'll keep coming back to it. But there is so much to talk about. But thank you so much for your time, your brilliance, your clarity. I don't know how, I mean, so brilliant at communicating really, really complex ideas. I loved that. I hope everybody else did. I just learned a ton. Thanks to everyone for joining in. Thanks for bearing with us as we ran over, which is very bad manners on Zoom, but we appreciate it. I hope you think we were both nattering away as we do. We should have just warned people, but this is going to run over because it's what we do. Hope people feel that it was worth a few extra minutes of your time, and we will try to do a part 2. So watch this space, and we'll hope to do it again. Hope everyone can check out the Being Human Festival, which this event is a part of. As we said, it will continue through the 20th of November, both online and in events around you all over the country. So please do have a look online. And Adam, you wanted to say a final?
Yeah, just a quickie. I've got another event in the same festival on Wednesday.
Oh, of course you do.
Talking about a lot more details about human history and in relation to archaeology and genetics. We won't mention the Great Gatsby. I think I probably will try to, but that's on Wednesday at 5, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I forgot. Yes, so it is one of our Being Human events, and I was supposed to tease that up. So yes, so Adam is part of an esteemed panel at Queen Mary that will be discussing some of these related ideas for the festival. So please do tune into that. Adam, thank you again. Always a pleasure, and we'll hope to pick this up again. Thank you.